So we have now a profile controller that can fetch a user from a data collection and then retrieve that particular user by ID. Yes? And so we can log in with Bob or Alice, right? And we get the data for that particular user that just logged in, right? But notice that the way that we implemented that was with some redundancy that we don't really want. Notice that the profile controller has the collection, and the login controller also has the same exact collection somewhere. Where's the login controller? There it is. Notice it has the array of users, right? And that's not acceptable, right? We're not going to have this data replicated in two different places. What we need is a single place that can host this data, right? And give it a single point of maintenance, right? That we can retrieve the data from this singleton instance, right? And give us a nice API that would allow us to manipulate the data, right? Allow us to create new instances, remove instances, find instances based on some criteria, right? So to do that, we're going to use what are called services, right? Services are singleton, single instance objects that are meant to serve as a single place that can be used across a framework, right? For instance, all these location and scope and all those are services that were created by the framework, right? By the Angular framework, and they all start with $, right? Any service that starts with $, is a service or provider that has been declared by the underlying framework. But we can create our own. We can create our own services, our own providers, and that's what we're going to do right now, right? We're going to create a service, right, to host all the data access in a single place. Okay? So let's do that. Let's create a service. So to do that, we're going to create here a directory that's going to host all our services. All right, so we're going to call services. Right? And the first service that we're going to create is the user service. So user.service.client.js. All right, notice the naming convention. User meaning that is the domain object or the data type or the entity or feature that we're going to be manipulating the data for. Typically, this maps to a server-side service, right, a web service that is going to be providing the real data for us. Right now, since we don't have a server just yet, I mean we do, but it's only hosting static content right now. Eventually, that service will host dynamic data, right? And this is the client side of two phases, right? The client side is right now is going to just host static mock data, but next week we'll see that it's going to go out to the server to fetch this data, all right? But for today, for this assignment, we're going to host static data here in this service. Okay. Next week we'll move the data over to a server-side web service, right? Which is going to be kind of like the sister of this client, and the name of that will be user service server.js. Okay. So this is a service on the client, meaning it's running on the browser, right? And we'll have a server version of this next week. All right. So let's create this service here. So to create service, there's actually two accepted ways to create a service. Today we'll talk about one of them. Both of them are acceptable. They both provide exactly the same functionality. It's a matter of preference. Okay. Today I'll show you one of them. It'll also be a nice segue to introduce another design pattern, the factory design pattern. All right. So let's take a look at it. So here we're going to declare the service using Angular, and we're going to fetch the module that we are coding. Right, we're coding the WAM module. We're adding new features to the WAM module. Right, the WAM module is hosting now two controllers, one for the login template and one for the profile template, and now it's going to host a service. Right, a new service. Okay. So to create a service, there's two accepted ways. One is using the factory decorator, right? And the other one is to use the service decorator. We'll do that tomorrow. Today I want to show you the factory decorator. Right? This says that I am declaring a singleton I am declaring a singleton user service that will be available across the framework, which will have as value whatever this function returns. Whatever this function returns. So this is using a factory pattern. The factory pattern is a design pattern that encapsulates the idea that sometimes when you want to create a new instance of a new object, it's fairly involved, right? Typically, if you want to create a new instance of something, right, you have a class and you just run like malloc or new or on that particular class, right? And it creates a new instance for you, correct? And typically you would use a constructor and you would pass all the attributes or parameters to the constructor that you need to create that new instance, correct? Now coming up with those parameters for that constructor might be involved, fairly complex. You might need to do a database access or a file access or go out to the network and find some data, right? Run some complex logic. And once you have all the attributes to call your constructor, then you call the constructor. Yes? Well, that logic, right? All that work that had to be done to instantiate it, it might not be the only place where you have to do that, right? Perhaps you have to do it in many other different places, right? So what we would like to be able to do is encapsulate all that logic in a single place, right? And have that one single place deal with all those rules and all those decisions, right? And that's where the factory comes in. Meaning, I want to create an instance of this thing. You deal with all those decisions, right? Just create me an instance of this thing and give me back a reference to it, right? You deal with all that complex logic, right? That's the idea of a factory pattern. And so all that logic of creating an instance is going to be encapsulated in this one function. Yes? But the idea is that it behaves like a constructor. All right? Make sense? All right. So what we're going to do here is we're going to host the data. So no longer are we going to have the array of users here. We don't want it there. Instead, we're going to put it in a single place here in the service. Okay? All right? And from here, we're going to encapsulate all the operations that we can apply on a user, right? On any user. We like to be able to create new instances, remove existing instances, find instances based on some criteria, either by ID or by username and password or by username, whatever criteria you need. Also like to be able to remove basically all the CRUD operations. Yes? We're going to encapsulate all those operations here inside of an API, right? Which we're going to implement as a map, okay? Or in JavaScript, right? This is a legitimate way of creating an instance of an object, right? Of using the literal curly brackets. This creates a brand new instance of an object, and you can tell it what attributes and values of that object, right? What we're going to put in here are, for instance, in the controller, right? We don't want this anymore. We don't want this list of users. What we want to do is encapsulate this functionality. We want to encapsulate it inside our API, right? So we're gonna copy this function, and we would like to put it inside and host it in the service. Yes, it is a service, the single point of access to our data, right? This data can only be manipulated through this service, through a well-curated API that we control, right? We are the gateways to the data, all right? We don't want to anybody just being able to access and modify this, right? It has to go through our API, right? And that's what we're going to return. We're going to return this API, and that's the object that everybody else needs to use to be able to call our functions and then to have access to our local data. Make sense? All this data is private to this service, right? Nobody can have access to it. Okay, so now now that we've created a service that is hosting the find user by ID, we can rewrite our controller, right, to use this service instead. Okay, so let's do that. So first of all, we just created this service. We need to declare it in our index file. Don't forget to declare it. Let's see. Let's declare it. We'll say script source src. No, it doesn't need to. Services, and then what's the other one? What's it called? User service. There it is. Okay, there it is. So it's loaded. And then in the controller, instead of using this, we need that service to find the user by ID. To do that, we're going to get a hold of that service. Just like we're calling these services over here, right? We can now refer to the service by its declared name, right? This registers this instance with the rest of the framework, right? So that we can refer to it from anywhere at the source code, right? In our source code. This is using another design pattern, which Angular copied from J2EE and .NET, from frameworks such as Spring MVC that allow you to declare instances of objects outside the source base, right? And then from the source code, you can then refer to these instances, right, by using annotations, right? You can say annotate, and you can ask for a service or a data source or any service that allows you to connect to the outside world. So same thing here. We are declaring this instance by name, and anybody who references it, right, the framework will inject, or it will pass it to you, that instance right here. So we can refer to it right here, saying user service dot find user by ID. Yes?
Do you even need it in the argument if the whole framework has access to it already?
It's not global.
Okay.
It's not global. It's only when you ask for it, right? So it's injected, or sometimes referred to as inversion of control. It is I who decides what I need, as opposed to somebody who's calling me deciding what I need, right? So we are inverting some of the roles here. It says I am asking for this user service, right, because I need it on demand and it's being passed to me, right? So let's see if we broke this. Let's see. All right, so Bob is there. We have 1, 2, 3. We have Alice. So this still works, right? So our controller is now using that service. Okay. Notice that the order of this doesn't matter. I can change the orders of the arguments, and this still works, right? So the framework parses your function, and it sees what you're asking. Oh, you're asking for these 3 arguments in that order, right? And I will call you. The framework calls you with those things that you asked for. Make sense? Yes.
So for our services, we don't need the $sign for it?
Right. So when you have $, that's only a nomenclature to give you a clue that these are services that are declared by the framework, right? And that they're not available to you, as opposed to services that you declare, right? Don't use $signs. I mean, you can, right? But it is a naming convention that gives a clue that these are framework services as opposed to services that you created, right? So let's rewrite the login, right? Because the login also had this. Let's go to the login controller, and now rewrite this. We also want the service here, so we want the user service here, user service, right? And so we want here this logic of finding a user, right? The right place for this is to put this in the service, right? Anything that manipulates the data, the controller should not have the responsibility of manipulating the data, right? The controller's responsibility is only listening for user events, delegating those actions to some service layer or business layer, right? Receiving a response from the data, and then providing the data for the view. Right, the controller itself should not be responsible for manipulating or touching the data. Right? So let's move that out of here, and let's put it where it belongs, in the service layer. There it is. And we'll put it in a function. perhaps call it function find user by credentials, and it's a for loop that iterates over this, and it takes as argument the username and password. Okay, so it's iterating over the users, and when it finds it, it's going to just return user, or at the end, it's just going to return null. Yes, right, and we're going to declare this brand new behavior, right, as part of the map, part of the API that we're returning, right, so that on the controller side, now what we do here is found is equal to user service dot find find user by credentials, and we're going to pass the username and password, right, and it's going to return that data. And again, we have the same information, right? If found is not null, then we navigate. Otherwise, we have username. Yes.
What is that in the service? What's that variable API? Do you call it API?
You don't have to call API. It's just a local map, right? You could say just this. You say return that. You could do that, right? Notice that you can't do that, right? Which is different, right? This immediately returns nothing, right? Whereas this returns the object that follows, right? So careful. All right. So let's see. So let's go back to the login. Let's go log out. Let's see if this works. Okay, so that works. So Bob log in, and indeed it logs in, or Alice, and we go and log in as Alice. Okay, that makes sense, right? So again, the service now is hosting some of those accessors that allow you to access a single point of access to the data. Right? It allows you to share this data across controllers, so that the only way for controllers to talk to one another should only be through services, right? Never through global. It's a global accessor that has a very well-defined API, right? Other APIs that we might want to put in here are create a user, right? Create user. Other things you might want to have here are update user, right? Or delete user, right? All implemented within their functions. Right? Create user, update user, and delete user. Make sense? Right? Which is basically the CRUD operations that you would expect for any entity. The only other thing is, notice that finders usually are more numerous, right, than the other ones, right? Typically, you might find that you're creating several finder operations, right? And the naming convention is that it's find, and then the name of the entity, user or website or page or whatever it is, and then by, and then some criteria, right? Credentials, username, find user by ID. Another one that you might need here is find user by username, right? Which is useful for when you're registering, right? And you want to check whether a username exists already, right? And let them know that you can't use that username, right? So you might have a function here that takes a username and looks up. It looks up for a user. And we can say return users dot find users dot find function user where return where user dot username is equal to username. Right? So when you find the user that matches the username, then the registration controller can use that, right? If the user is already there, right, I'm going to pop up a message saying, sorry, that username is taken. Right? If the username is not there, then I will register you, and I will create a user object instance, right? And I will push it onto the array. We say users dot push user, right? Perhaps right here we can add a dummy or a mock ID, right? We can say user.id. It's a brand new user we just created, right? Which provides a username, password, first name, last name, whatever the registration page. Oh, actually, no, just username and password, right? It's going to this. So this is only going to have the username and password. We're going to add the ID right here. You can use the following: new date. Creates an instance of a date, and you can get the time, which is a timestamp, right, of so many minutes or seconds from the beginning of time, or 1970. So that gives a, oh, but this is a number, right? It's a number. We need to convert it into a string because everywhere we're using strings. And notice that the find user by ID is doing a triple equal. So it's going to make sure that they're both strings, right? Otherwise, it's going to fail. It would only work for Bob, Alice, Charlie, but it would not work for any of the new users that you create. Okay. So here we're just casting it. Well, not casting. We're concatenating with a string to convert it into a string. Other things you might want to have here are update user, where you're looking for a particular user ID, and you are passing the new data for that particular user. So you would do a for loop looking for that user by ID. When you find it, you update first name, last name, or email, or address, or whatever it is that you're updating. And delete, you are looking for a user by the user ID, and you're going to splice out that user from the array, right? So for instance, you might find the user, right? So you can do var user users find function user and return user dot ID matches the user ID, right? Once you have the ID, you need to know what index is it in the original array, right? And you can say var index something like users dot index of user, right? And then you can splice out users dot splice, and remove at index one element. So it's removing that particular element from the array. Okay. Let's see what else. All right. So this service, right? You need to work. We'll keep working on these services from the various controllers, right? And we'll build the application using these controllers, these templates, and these services. Make sense? All right. Let's leave it here.